Over the last year or so, we've really enjoyed taking a look back at how some players in different gaming communities have been able to just beat a game that oftentimes takes most players 5 to 6 hours on a normal difficulty in just about an hour on the hardest difficulty. And when we found out a group of Halo 3 players were able to beat Halo 3 in just a little bit over an hour on legendary difficulty, we immediately asked ourselves, how? Well, we got the full breakdown for you, so let's go ahead and jump into it. So of course, since this run is a 4-player Halo 3 co-op speedrun with a time of just 1 hour and 3 minutes, a team of 4 speedrunners came together for this run and really worked on a hybrid of different strategies along the way. For this specific world record run, we got to see Tadanza, Sun100, Pokem King, and the Blaze JP come together to pull off some of the awesome stuff that goes into this run. And of course, they helped us break down everything they did in this video because some of this stuff was over our heads, so huge shout out to them, of course, and you can get a link to all of their stuff in the description below. Now, what's really interesting is when it comes to Halo 3 co-op, there are many advantages over a solo type speedrun, as you can do more things consistently and focus less on the RNG type things that a solo speedrun typically would have. Co-op also has certain tricks and routes that a normal solo player can't do, and one thing that's really interesting about this specific run is that there's a focus on how to maneuver this route for all 4 players rather than just taking a solo run and adapting from there. They also told us that along the way when coming up with their optimized run, having 4 different weapons and 4 different viewpoints on certain levels have allowed them to continuously improve and make their routes even better. So diving into this run, it's really interesting to see the strategies they use along the way. On Sierra 117, the main objective of this mission is just to keep player 1, in this case it was Tadanza, alive so that he can proceed throughout the level and focus mostly on movement, which means the other players are really in charge of constantly killing enemies and providing distractions along the way so that these enemies that are on legendary difficulty don't just kill the main runner and cause a wipe for this run. That's really unique in this case because having a co-op setting for the speedrun definitely makes the other players equally as important, as they have their own roles and have to know exactly what can be a major threat to the main runner who's going at the fastest speed possible. And then of course the main runner also has to trust that their teammates are going to do a good job at clearing the way for him so that he can continuously do all of the maneuvers as fast as possible. On this first level, they actually had each player assigned to different enemies along the way so that there was never this crossfire thing happening where another enemy is maybe left in the open when they could possibly be tackling multiple enemies at the same time. As they progress through this level, you actually can see that they are definitely taking into consideration a lot of things on the go and have to adapt their entire run accordingly. For instance, when they get to the Jackal Forest section, the weapons that drop in this area are actually really important, as it kind of determines which role players like Sun100 or the Blaze JP take in the next part of the level. In the case here, there was an extra beam rifle present, so Sun100 uses it to focus on the snipers during the dam fight. If it wasn't this case, then we would have seen Blaze focus on them instead. In the last area of this level, where they have to quickly rescue Johnson, this is a great example of how co-op play is very different from solo, because they can actually use the players that aren't doing the main part of the run to trigger certain parts of the end of the level and can essentially take the fastest route possible without worrying about maybe missing some mission triggers and soft locking the level. So with these strategies in place and just moving as quickly as possible, they're able to clear this first level of Halo 3 in just under 5 minutes. But going on to Crow's Nest, it's a whole different behemoth of a level. During this level, there's a lot of attention paid to where the players are and what sequences spawn so that they can move as fast as possible. Towards the beginning in the hangar section, they actually do a trick called spawn bumping, where they can spawn a player outside of the hangar fight so that when they finish the hangar fight, they can get a head start and have players already waiting at the next section. Sometimes along the way, they have the team spread out and stand in certain places just to make sure that mission progression triggers will actually hit, and they use this to their advantage to also avoid enemies spawning in as well. And by doing so, they can actually skip huge sections where you would typically have to walk for a long time. Another really interesting trick that they use when running through through Crow's Nest is definitely a deployable cover clip, which essentially by using a deployable cover, they're able to clip through the door on Legendary, which does make this faster. They also make sure they don't hit the triggers to spawn the drones, allowing the trick to be a little bit easier to execute, as well as you don't have to worry about these drones flying around shooting at you. Now, if you played Halo 3 on Legendary, you probably know that on Crow's Nest, the part where all of the brutes and chieftain are can be a little bit stressful as there's a lot going on. Essentially, when they get to this part, they do a quick fight versus the brutes and the chieftain. Danza quickly grabs the hammer and invincibility in order to proceed along as fast as possible, while the other players focus on the rest of the enemies to make the route as safe as possible. They actually do a hammer launch clear across the barracks and allow them to skip that whole interior section and get straight over to the elevator area. And by bypassing the entire barracks section, they actually don't have to wait for the elevator to come to the bottom before allowing it to take them up to the top, which is really interesting, a really unique way just to shave off a couple seconds along the way. Now, another really interesting trick that they have found here is that if you look at the exit door towards the end of the jetpack fight section, you can actually spawn a player through it doing that spawn bump trick from earlier and allow a player to hit the trigger points ahead of time so they don't have to wait for the door to open to progress through the level. Going on to Savo Highway, this level is pretty straightforward and somewhat similar to what you would see in a regular Halo 3 speedrun, though there are a few interesting tricks they used along the way to save some time on this co-op run. For instance, when they're approaching the giant shield, the player in the passenger side seat of a Warthog can actually throw a grenade and take out the shield himself, which saves the driver time from having to jump out and go and destroy the shield. Now, they did run into a slight problem on this run, and somehow they managed to pull off a save, which was really cool here. When they were going to the section where essentially they have to make the Warthog clear this bridge if they want to get the fastest time possible, they actually messed up the bridge skip, but fortunately enough, Pokem King was able to use the gravity lift as a backup plan and quickly assume the role of player one to continue on the level. This is really cool as a bridge skip, and just the fact that they're able to save their run here, and it's a great example of how oftentimes in these types of runs with multiple players, you kind of have to think on your feet and quickly come up with an alternative plan to save the run from being a complete wipe or having to go to last checkpoint or something like that. Another really interesting thing about Halo 3 co-op speedruns, or just Halo 3 speedrunning in general, is that weapons can carry over level to level. So at the end of this level, we actually see Sun 100 grab the fuel rod gun to carry it over on the storm, and it's super helpful because he can essentially use it in sections that are kind of crazy, like the lake bed areas. During the storm, there's a lot of these big open areas, and definitely having strategies for these open areas can be very important. In this first lake bed area, we definitely see them optimizing their combat and just moving together to get through it as quickly as possible. If you remember from the previous level, when Sun grabbed the fuel rod gun, he actually carried that so he could pass it over to Danza during this level, which definitely made the second area a lot easier. During the second lake bed area, where the Scarab typically spawns in, you can see how things get pretty complex in this speedrun, but it is really cool how they split off into different teams to pull off everything here. So essentially, they pulled off into teams of two, with Danza and Pokem King taking on the left-hand side of enemies, while Sun and Blaze focus on the right-hand side. Danza used the missile pod turret and the fuel rod gun from the previous level to target at the two phantoms. Pokem King, on the other hand, parks a mongoose so that later they can collect it for a door clip, which is an important skip. Now, at the section where the Scarab typically comes in, they actually use a mongoose and then block the spawns with 3 players, so the game spawns the 4th at the other side of the door. Now, there is a brief moment where they can just chill and wait for a second because they actually have to wait for the Scarab to spawn in, but it actually allows them to bypass the whole area as the game thinks that the Scarab is dead because they have already moved forward in this section. They then start running forward into the next zone load to delete the Scarab, thus the game thinking it is truly dead and allowing them to move forward. Then in this final sequence, the main threat that they have are these hunters, which definitely are a time sink to clear the way, as they're deadly enough where you don't want to get caught up having to fight them. In this case, we see Danza perform a trick with a gravity lift to deload the hunters, which then of course makes the final area much safer and easier to survive. And then after performing the trick, the 3 other players die in order to spawn in and help in the final section. Blaze also grabs the gravity hammer to carry over to the next level, since for whatever reason, Master Chief can't carry over that specific weapon. Kind of a weird nuance when it comes to Halo 3. This level, which is typically a pretty lengthy level is completed in just 4 minutes and 50 seconds with these strategies. Next, we're going on to Floodgate, and essentially this one is a very linear level, and it's one of the fastest levels to do even solo. And while there's a lot of solo strategies they use here, they still use this co-op section to do a few things to speed up the time as well. Most notably, they use the gravity hammer at the beginning of the level to do a gravity hammer launch, which just essentially gives a lot of forward momentum and downward vertical momentum, which just moves the players along just a bit faster, and it's really helpful for the main leader to get through this early section and shave off a couple seconds as well. And the other massive trick that they use on this level definitely are when they use the deployable covers to do a launch, which completely clears large sections of this level as well, letting them finish this whole level in just 3 minutes and 5 seconds. And while their pace is really well, there's definitely some more challenging levels coming up as they're going onto the Arc, which they told us was one of the hardest co-op levels as it's a very trick and combat intensive level for a speedrun. And it's actually dependent on having a sniper rifle at the very end of the level, which means you have to carry your sniper from the beginning all the way through the entire level. First things first, when they first start spawning in, they do a trick called spawn abuse, which is at the start of the level when the 2 pelicans fly in, the blue elite player actually has a better spawn than the 3 other players, so the other players then die so that they can spawn where the blue elite is. Now along the way they move really quickly through this, but they do a lot of little sequence skips that definitely help progress faster, but sometimes can have some weird side effects along the way. For instance, there's a part where they skip a trigger before the Forward Unto Dawn flies in by climbing the cliff walls with ghosts, but with some proper preparation they can actually plan ahead and park vehicles in certain spots so that when weird side effects happen, like in this case after Dawn lands the players are teleported somewhere else beyond the cave, they can actually jump in a vehicle and drive off immediately. This actually allowed them to avoid more enemies before getting to the part where Spark opens up the door. At the part where they have to kind of clear all the enemies at the door, they essentially divided the players into killing different vehicles along the way, so one player would take out the Wraiths while others focus on the ghosts, choppers, and phantoms accordingly. Immediately after getting to the final section where typically you face off against the Scarab, if you move fast enough you can actually leap off of a tree and get inside of the Scarab to take it out early, while the rest of the players push up the side of the building to take out the jackals that are on top and that are required to die to progress the mission forward. They also do a little quick fix right here to save a few seconds as well by killing a Marine before he can get inside, so that we don't have this dialogue where Guilty Spark kind of shocks him for a second and then they converse or whatnot. You can just skip that by letting that Marine, you know, just oof away. Then in this final section where you have to run down to the lower level, typically there's a kill barrier stopping you from jumping down to the lower section. But fortunately enough, with this kill barrier being so low, one player can push forward into the invisible brute room while the other players can use equipment to lower themselves down a bit, and the player that brought the sniper from the very beginning can actually immediately kill all of the enemies that spawn in before they spread out too much, which definitely saves a lot of time in what would normally be a really long firefight section. And with all these strats coming together, they're able to beat this whole level in under 10 minutes, taking them on to the Covenant. Now, while for the most part co-op runs like this are able to bypass a lot of RNG, but when we get to the Covenant, this level is one of the hardest and can often be a run killer because it is the most dependent on luck in this case. To get through this, the strategy that they use is dependent on getting a deployable cover to drop, which is a random drop chance, but along the way they also have to make sure they have a player that can carry an active camo all the way through the level and make it to the end citadel with it. Now essentially, out of the different types of brutes that you face off against, these specific brutes that you see on the screen are the ones that are most likely to drop a deployable cover. Now they don't always drop one, but those are the ones that will carry it, while the other ones typically don't have one. Upon getting to the section where you have to clear out the beach, the main strategy here is to clear out all of the enemies as fast as possible, and with each player targeting specific enemies, it definitely becomes very systematic how they pick off the enemies on the way. Once they clear this section, the search for a deployable cover begins, which can be dropped from that first AA Wraith or even the Banshees that Danza kills in this case. While they're pushing forward, we actually see Sun 100 juggle the beam rifle so that Danza can use it later on during the first tower brute fight. Now, interestingly enough, this tower section is crucial for the run, as since the players after clearing the tower have to make their way back to the beach to get to the Hornet section, they definitely have a opportunity to skip a lot of the typical wait time going up and down the tower. By splitting up into groups, they actually have 2 players outside the tower time the exact moment that the level is going to despawn to enter and exit vehicles, and by coordinating over communication and making sure that they're doing it at the perfect moment, they can actually survive being out in the deload area just long enough so that when they finish killing off the brutes and hit the button, they can load back in when that section of the level loads and have a huge head start to getting over to the Hornets, saving a ton of time along the way. Now, surprisingly enough, when you get to the part with the Hornet, it is one of those moments that is kind of the highest pressure and highest stakes here, because at this point 3 players have items that they need to do the rest of this level as quickly as possible. One player has a gravity hammer, the other player has the active camo, and a third player has a deployable cover. And while they're making their way through this Hornet part, they have to make sure that they are protecting each other, because if one person dies here, not only are they not going to have their weapons equipped, but their weapons are going to fall into the water and they're not going to be able to get the equipment that they need to do the skips later on. But things definitely pick up when you get to the third tower, because if you thought the other tricks were interesting, this one's a little bit advanced. Now, at the third tower, they save about 50 seconds by not going back down the elevator after clearing it. Instead, they do a sideways deployable cover launch to get a player to exit the tower and use what is called an elastic barrier to control his descent so he doesn't die from falling too far. Players then can spawn on the primary player who just performed the trick, and this allows the primary player to go straight to the Hornets, while the other players hit any of the necessary progression triggers to skip the entire tower exit part and continue on. Meanwhile, in this case, a 4th player stands back, spawn jumping and meleeing to block the players from spawning on him, because he's holding on to that active camo that they need later on. They quickly clear the Scarab section in the next part of the level, and it's really cool how fast they're able to get through this part. But the more impressive time save is the fact that in the final bridge area where you team up with the Flood, Danza is able to use that active camo that they've been saving this whole time and hammer swing all the way to the end of the bridge to get to the cutscene that kills Truth, and then just quickly launch his way all the way back to end the level. But interestingly enough, Danza makes it a point to save at least 1 hammer swing so that on the next level he can use that hammer if needed. Now, this level is one of the few levels that has very limited benefits of doing co-op, so essentially players 2, 3, and 4, their main objective is just to make sure that player 1 stays alive. Now, with the moments where Cortana and Gravemind kind of jump up and slow players down, there are a few moments that can be overlapped if you're fast enough, and in some sections you'll be able to run at full speed during the moment that comes up, which is a trick that they use to save some time. Now, of course, with this level kind of being more of a solo type level, they did struggle a little bit, and they said that they wish they would have gotten a little bit of a better time here, but overall their runtime was really well. So they cleared this level just by running through it essentially as fast as possible before loading up on the final level that would essentially make or break this entire run. The whole crux of the Halo 3 final level, Halo, is completing the tower fight as fast as possible. And unfortunately, the tower is essentially this firefight with a lot of random elements added in. However, with their knowledge on Halo 3, they are able to predict a lot of the events that happen, especially on co-op, and while they were able to break down exactly how many waves there are on legendary difficulty, with there being 3 different waves here, they can kind of predict in one way or another where the enemies spawn during each wave. Now, the big thing that kind of comes down to random chance is definitely when the location of the enemy spawns are based off of where the players are looking. So while it is somewhat random, or at least shrouded in some mystery code that Bungie's put together, they are able to sometimes predict what's going on with the enemy spawns, and they can somewhat predict a little bit better to spawn kill the enemies faster to speed along the firefight. Those spiders that typically climb up the wall are actually able to be spawn killed from the pit, and the quicker they kill enemies before they even make their way to the top, the faster they can actually progress through the firefight section. They essentially pay a lot of attention to what's going on here, because at the end of every wave, if enough of the enemies are dead and there's no enemies on top and they're not looking at enemies, the game will actually automatically delete any of the remaining enemies, which which speeds along this firefight section even faster. And by being able to predict where they are in the wave and how close they are to the end, they can actually look away from a certain area to force the deletion of remaining enemies, and that's really interesting. After progressing to the final section of this level where you take out Guilty Spark and run back outside, interestingly enough, they go for the ghost instead of taking the warthog that's typically expected, as you on legendary difficulty have access to 4 ghosts here. After speeding through the hallway section where the flood is, they then take the warthog to drive through the final driving section of Halo 3, and somehow managed to clear this entire level with the firefight, the boss fight, and the warthog run in just 10 minutes and 10 seconds, bringing their overall time for this speed run to just 1 hour, 3 minutes, and 50 seconds, which is really awesome to see. Now, of course, we want to give a huge shout out to all of these guys who helped us out with this video. They went into so much detail to just explain to us some of these tricks that were kind of over our head. And then also a shout out to their coach, Sleepless Blue. It's really impressive to see players who just take a game like this and are able to optimize it in the ways that they did, and that's really awesome to see. But hey, after all of that, if you like this video, be sure to subscribe with the notifications on for more videos just like this one, and you won't miss anything we upload, even if YouTube's acting all whack. Also, if you want to, you can follow us on Twitter. You can follow me at Rocket Elijah, or you can follow Luke at Rocket Sloth Luke. Thank you guys so much for watching, and we'll see you all next time with a brand new video. Bye, guys.